Hi folks, Spencer Harbour here, Chief Architect with Clear People. Earlier this year in Mainz at the European Collaboration Summit, there was a session on user profile synchronization with Identity Manager and SharePoint Server. Unfortunately, due to the time constraints, we weren't able to complete all of the demonstrations. Therefore, this video is going to walk through all of the demos end to end with a little bit of additional explanation as well as we go. So the first demonstration, or demonstration 0, is basically a pre-canned environment using the old approach, the way we used to do things with SharePoint 2013 and indeed SharePoint 2010. So we're using user profile synchronization service to bring in data from Active Directory, and then we're going to also use business connectivity services to augment those profiles with additional properties. And this is a very common customer deployment, a way of connecting the profile information that's coming from Active Directory with additional properties from other systems, line of business systems or a HR system. Then we'll walk through a demonstration of configuring all of the things that we need to do in SharePoint to get ready for using Identity Manager and the use of the Identity Manager toolkit to get up and running with the basic Active Directory import. So let's dive into the first demonstration. Before I sort of walk through SharePoint site configuration, just show you the environment. It's a fairly basic environment, the sort of minimum number of machines I need to be able to show everything. And here I am on the domain controller. You can see we have an organizational unit structure here where we have one OU called Fabricam users, and then underneath there we have OUs for each country in this particular example, and then we have within each of those countries a whole bunch of users. Now this first group of users at the top here, where you can see there's a little bit of a change in the icon there, these are disabled accounts. So we'll make use of that later on so that we can make sure that these disabled users don't come across into SharePoint. If I go ahead and open up one of these users, you can see that some of the attributes have been pre-populated with some sample data. So we have a telephone number in here, of course, an email address. We also have the organizational properties, or some of them at least, populated. So in this case, the job title and the manager, which is a reference to another object in Active Directory naturally. Also, if we take a look at the attribute editor, we can see that the thumbnail photo attribute has also been populated here. And this is the binary data of a JPEG file. Just to prove the point, if we come out of here, we can use a different tool that will render those images, so you can see that each user has an image associated with it. So that's our first data store, Active Directory. Then of course we have a SQL Server. Now the SQL Server is hosting our SharePoint databases and indeed our Identity Manager databases, but what I've done here is concocted an example, very simple example database, which represents a line of business system. So in this example it's called Fabricam HR. We have a table in this database called employee data, and you can see a snapshot here of the types of things that are in here. We've got the employee ID, the employee type, first name, last name, department and status. Now this is very common in so much as in most organizations Active Directory is not the source of record for all properties. You know, the employee ID is master sourced within the Fabricam HR system in this example. We also have another table for schools, and what I've gone ahead here and done is create what's called a MIM friendly view. This will make more sense in the second demonstration, but you can see we have a column here that seems as if it might be redundant. It's called attribute name, and every row has the same value of school. we're going to leverage this later inside of Identity Manager to support bringing across multi-value data into the system. So that's our second data source, SQL Server. I'm going to come over onto this machine and just come out of the presentation here for a second. This is a very simple SharePoint 2013 farm, single server, and I've pre-configured everything on here just to walk you through the types of things that customers used to do with user profile sync. So if we take a look at the profile store, you can see that we've already gone ahead and synchronized 212 users, and you can see from the profile sync settings here that it's using user profile sync. If we take a look at the sync connections, we'll see we have 3 here. We have the core one, which is the Active Directory one, and then we have 2 BDC connections. One is for the multi-value data, the schools, and then one for the other standard data, the single value data, such as employee status and so forth. Of course, a business data connectivity sync connection requires an external content type. So we've got one external content type for the multi-value data and one external content type for the single value data. Also, as you might expect, we've leveraged the default taxonomic properties that are configured for us if we set up the farm correctly. So our department and job title has been populated. Now the job title, if you were for the sort of eagle-eyed ones of you, that's coming from the Active Directory property that we saw in the user attribute screen in AD, but the department is coming from the SQL Server database. So once all of this is set up, it basically gives us a basic public profile view here. You can see the combination of all of these elements have been brought together within this UI. So we've got the profile picture, we've obviously got the data here that's coming from Active Directory, then we've got the additional profile data, the multi-value schools, the employee ID, the employee type, and we've also got the reference data rendered here in this kind of org chart type view. So fairly basic things, and most customers would obviously customize this a little bit more. There would obviously hopefully be some actual activity for users, of course, in this space, but it might be the type of thing that's used to build a white pages or employee directory type of approach. So you can see the sort of search results that you get based on a keyword term here for users. So fairly basic stuff, but this is what we want to try and replicate at the end of all of the demonstrations using SharePoint 2016. Okay, so if we move on to another machine here, this is a server that's part of a SharePoint 2016 farm. It's a 4-server farm. That's not particularly important at this moment, but there are a few things that are related to topology that need to be factored into your design considerations. So this farm's already kind of been pre-configured. I've got a couple of web applications, but otherwise everything is empty. So the term store is empty, the profile store is empty, and so on and so forth. Now, before we get started working with Identity Manager, like many things in the SharePoint universe, there's some esoteric settings that need to be taken care of, ideally before we get started with doing anything inside of Identity Manager. Some prerequisites, if you will. So if we take a look at the user profile service, you can see this has already been set up. It's empty. Well, it's not quite empty. We do have one profile. That's the farm administrator that I'm logged in as, but there's been no other sync connections. And our profile sync settings here indicate that we're using the default mode, which is Active Directory import, of course. Now there is a important point to note at this stage. Let's say our requirements are exactly what we saw in the SharePoint 2013 file. So we've got some properties coming in from AD into SharePoint. We have the user profile photo coming in from Active Directory, and then a couple of custom properties coming in from a SQL Server database. I've deliberately chosen those examples to keep the demonstration relatively simple so that I can focus on all of the key configuration aspects. But if that was a real-world situation, we need to ask ourselves whether it's truly worth the investment of money, time and effort to configure a Microsoft Identity Manager infrastructure and keep that running over the life cycle of the deployment. Because we could just make use of Active Directory import alongside some custom PowerShell scripts to take care of the profile photos and the values from SQL Server. Where Identity Manager really comes into its own is when you've got multiple directory systems, multiple line of business systems, and you want to do more interesting things in terms of the profile data across the organization. So just bear that in mind that whilst I'm showing this, MIM and the servers needed to support it, and the backup and restore processes, the high availability processes, the scheduling and so on, all combine to make quite a complex infrastructure on top of SharePoint in order to deliver that functionality. So the first step is to change the synchronization mode for the user profile service application. Now, we have this option here, configure synchronization settings, and you can see it gives us two options, one the default AD import and then one called enable external identity manager. Now we can of course use this user interface to toggle between the modes, although be cautious here, because I have an empty UPA at present. That's okay, I can turn it on to external identity manager, and then if I perhaps wanted to, I might also be able to switch back to AD import. But once I have profiles in the profile store, switching modes is not just as straightforward as changing this option. So this is something that you want to design for ahead of time before you do that initial full synchronization. Also, whilst this option is presented within the user interface, there is another option that can be important. So I tend not to use the user interface, and instead I'm going to use some PowerShell. I'm just going to bring up the scripts here. This just takes a few seconds to load. So I have a bundle of little scriptlets here for the purposes of the demonstration. I've got a couple of helper functions here which I'm just going to quickly load in. And so if I pass in the name of my profile service application into the get function, you can see the results in the terminal here. It tells me that Active Directory mode is, or Active Directory import mode is configured, and NetBIOS domain names are not enabled. So we saw the AD import option, or the identity approach option, in the user interface. That one can be toggled there, but the second property, the NetBIOS domain names, cannot be changed by the user interface. Now this is a bit of a strange default, because in this example my fully qualified domain name is fabricam.com and my legacy Windows NT NetBIOS type name is Fabricam, so they do match, so I don't need to worry about this setting. But in most customer deployments the names don't match. It might be using a .local domain or something like that, or there was a legacy migration, and so the NetBIOS domain name doesn't match the fully qualified domain name. So generally speaking, this NetBIOS domain name setting really should be enabled by default, because if the names do match, then it works. It doesn't take any effect. And if they don't match, it is required. So it's kind of a nonsensical default, but it was actually added after the initial release of SharePoint 2010, and so that's why the default remains the same. So that's why I prefer using PowerShell here, aside from the automation benefits, because it allows me to set both of the properties that I'm interested in. I'm going to do that just by calling this function here. Now you can see that External Identity Manager is configured, and so are NetBIOS domain names. Now if I'm quick enough and I come back over here and refresh this screen, you can see that the UI tells me that User Profile Sync is not currently provisioned. Now that's quite amusing, given that User Profile Sync doesn't actually exist anymore, but the UI hasn't really been updated, and if I refresh you can see that eventually it comes back and tells me now that External Identity Manager is enabled. Now this is an important setting in terms of preventing accidental administrator mistakes. So if I come over here and choose Configure Sync Connections and then choose to create a new connection, you can see we're going to see a little warning here, or a block that basically tells us we can't do that because we've configured External Identity Manager. That's actually really good, because if we don't set that property and then go ahead and configure everything in MIM, it will still work, but an administrator could come along and create a sync connection using ADI, and then the two things would be conflicting with each other when it comes to the profile store. Also bear in mind you do need to be on a recent build of SharePoint 2016. The early RTM builds, and for about 4 or 5 months after RTM, there was a bug with the setting, and therefore some of the documentation advised not configuring it, but it is a recommended setting for the recent builds. We also have some other esoteric configuration details required. In a little bit we're going to configure a thing called a management agent for SharePoint. The way that works is it connects to the User Profile Import-Export web service on central administration. We cannot call it on any other web application, it must be central administration. So that gives us two important things that we need to think about. The first one is to make sure that we're using SSL for the central administration web application. This is personal information that's going across the network, so therefore it should be SSL. It's also it increases the importance of making sure that you have high availability for central administration. If you only have one machine running it, and for whatever reason that machine's down, the sync operations will not work during the period of time that the box is unavailable. Because we call that web service, we also require that the account that is used is a member of the farm administrators group that you can see on screen here. Now a lot of documentation or guides out there make quite some fuss about making sure you use the farm account to do this. That's an extremely bad idea. Even if we ignore the information security problems with that, the real downside, or real practical downside, is in order for that to work you're going to have to give the farm account credentials, the password, to whomever is looking after the Identity Manager server. So a very bad idea. We want to pick a dedicated account that we're going to use just for the purposes of performing sync operations. That also gives us the benefit of being able to trace things more easily if we get into an error condition later. So I could go ahead and add that user here via the UI. Again, I have a PowerShell script that will do that as well. It's very straightforward, just basically adds the appropriate account into that group and then outputs the results. So we're just executing that quickly here, and you can see at the bottom that our SPMA, or SharePoint Management Agent account, has been added into the farm administrators. I can come back over here, refresh this screen, and see it's entered in here as well. But there's more. There's one last thing that we need to do to make sure that everything hangs together. We have our profile photos coming in from that thumbnail photo attribute in Active Directory. Now unfortunately, unless we configure a permission policy and a user policy for the same account, we will not be able to get the thumbnails generated correctly for all the images. This is a bug related to the import-export web service, so we must create a workaround for that. So we've got permission policies here, which I could go ahead and create in the UI, and of course user policies as well. But unfortunately, this is one of the things that another one of the things that we must do in PowerShell. So I've got another snippet here which is going to take care of that for us. I'm just going to run this and then I'll explain why we need to do this in PowerShell. So if we come back over here and refresh this page, I'm going to select the web application that hosts the MySite root or MySite host site collection, bring up the permission policy. You can see that we've now got one here called MIM photo import, and if we dive into that, it's a pretty simple thing. We've got add, edit, delete and view items, and then further down somewhere there'll be open website list and library. So it's a fairly small set of permissions, nothing too complicated there. But if we look at the user policy, this is why we need to use PowerShell. See, it's here at the bottom, but we've added the account using the classic user identifier, in other words domain/user. Now because the MySite host web application is a claims-based application, if I add users here in the user interface, it's going to create them using the claims user identifier, and that will not work. So unfortunately for this particular configuration, PowerShell is the only way. So now we've configured our SharePoint user profile service, or user profile service application I should say, and the MySite host and the permissions necessary. We can now move over into some Agile Identity Manager work. So I have a single server here running Identity Manager. On the screen at the moment you can see the MIM portal. Now I've put this on here to support other demonstrations, but also to point out that this component of MIM is not licensed with SharePoint 2016. So if you do want to take advantage of all of the other features of MIM, there is additional license cost involved. The only component that we're licensed to use as part of a SharePoint deployment is the synchronization service component. So here it's installed on this machine. You can see that this is empty. We have no management agents. It's basically a default install. But what I also have installed is the SharePoint connector, which is a separate download. It's free and it's from Microsoft, but it's a separate download, and we install that once we've installed MIM Sync itself. So you can see that we have an empty configuration. If we look at the Metaverse Designer and I select the person object and I scroll through the bottom here, you can see there aren't any of the SharePoint properties that we might expect to see, things like SPS department and so on. So how do we get started with this stuff? Well, on GitHub at the RTM of SharePoint 2016 there's a toolkit published, and this toolkit is basically a collection of sample configurations and a PowerShell module which includes some commandlets for working with the configuration. And then we also have a source code for a thing called a rules extension, which we'll come back to in a little bit. So I've got a little workpad here which is basically just going to go ahead and install a basic configuration for us in order to give us something to get started working on. So I'm going to run this. It's going to ask me for some credentials. Hope I get them right because they're not actually validated here. And then I've basically imported the module. So I'm just going to talk through the, actually what I'll do here just to speed things up a little bit, so I'm going to run the install SharePoint sync configuration commandlet as well. Now the parameters that are being passed in here are defined up the top. Now at present there's a number of issues with the toolkit, and I'll come back to those towards the end of the demonstration, but we need to basically specify a working path, and that's the path to the sample configuration files. Unfortunately the commandlet doesn't really do dot sourcing correctly at the moment. Then we have the URL for central administration, the forest DNS name that we're going to sync with, an account that we're going to use to speak to Active Directory, in this case SPP sync, and then an account that speaks to SharePoint, which is the account that we configured as a farm administrator and with that web application policy. Then we have a picture flow which can be export or import. The import is something that you can pass in, but within the SharePoint connector there is no implementation, so it won't do anything. So the only one that sort of works at present is to export from Active Directory into SharePoint. Now the AD management agent account here, SPP sync, this account is the one that will need replicating directory changes on the domain controller. So this is no different than working with user profile sync or indeed Active Directory import. I have another PowerShell script here which is useful because we might not be able to access Active Directory. We might have to ask somebody else to go ahead and make those changes for us. So we can use this script to basically validate that that configuration has been applied correctly before we get started. If we look further back, when we ran the installation script, we've got a couple of warnings that have popped up here. You can see that it's telling us the password must be set on the AD connection before synchronization will work, and then towards the bottom it's basically reiterating that warning and gives us the instructions on what to do. So although we need to provide the credentials in order to get this far, the toolkit at present is not able to persist that password. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. If I come back over into the Sync Service Manager and refresh this screen, you can see that the toolkit has added a couple of management agents based on those XML configuration files that ship with the toolkit. Now note the name of the management agents. At present they're hard-coded to be ADMA and SPMA. For this example that's perfectly adequate. But in the real world it's very likely you might have more than one directory, more than one SharePoint. So these would be terrible names, and so that's another thing that will be addressed in future releases of the toolkit. In order to persist that password, we're just going to double click the ADMA and go to the connection screen, and you can see there's no password in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and enter the password in and click OK, and that's in theory all I need to do there for that management agent before I perform a sync run. If you remember, I mentioned a thing called a rules extension, and that was the source code that comes with the toolkit. When we run the install SharePoint sync configuration commandlet, as well as creating these two management agents and a bunch of metaverse properties, we also compile and deploy that rules extension into MIM, and you can see it's referenced here, the metaverse rules extension called SharePoint Synchronization. But unfortunately the toolkit doesn't give us a warning here like it did for the AD import, or sorry, the AD management agent, that we also need to do something else. Because as this is the first time that we've deployed that rules extension into a fresh MIM sync install, the SharePoint management agent isn't actually aware that it exists. So if we did attempt to go ahead and perform a sync now, it would fail. So we also need to open up the SharePoint management agent, go to the connection screen, and click OK. And you see we get a little egg timer. That's basically refreshing the configuration. Then I can click OK, and now everything is completed. If I open this up and go to the extension screen, you can see the presence here of the newly deployed rules extension. Okay, so in theory at this point we're good to go. We can go ahead and run what's called synchronization run profiles to bring in information from AD into MIM and then export it to SharePoint. But I want to do a couple of other things that the toolkit at present doesn't take care of for us. So I'm going to open up the Active Directory Management Agent again. I'm going to go to the Select Attributes panel here, and if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, we can see one attribute we're particularly interested in isn't currently available. So the user account control is the property that determines, the status of the individual account, whether it's disabled, locked out, requires password change, all of those kind of things. And if you remember, we had some disabled accounts inside AD that we want to avoid or filter so that they don't come into SharePoint. So I'm going to select that attribute, and then once I've done that, when I come to the connection filter screen, that attribute is now available for us to create a filter. So I'll create a filter based on that attribute. The operator is bit on equals, the bit mask is 2. I'm going to add that condition, click OK. So now I'm going to filter out all of the disabled accounts. If I take a look at the attribute flow window, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. It's much easier to work with if you increase the size of this screen. And we take a look at the user object type, which is displayed twice in here. You can see how the mapping is done between the data source attribute, i.e. the AD connector space attribute, and the value that's in the metaverse. And you can see that we've created in the metaverse, the toolkit has created all of these properties and configured this attribute flow. So I'm not going to make any more changes here. We've just sort of enhanced it a little bit by including the filter on disabled accounts. If we take a look at the run profiles, this is also being created for us by the toolkit. These are the different types of run profile necessary to perform synchronization operations. There are a few also that it doesn't create for us that would be nice to have, combined steps. Again, something that we're looking to change in the toolkit in future versions. The module also provides us with some sync operation commandlets, and one of them here is start SharePoint sync, which is basically the equivalent of a full synchronization in previous versions of the product. So I'm going to kick this off, and you can see down the bottom we're performing some operations. And if I come over here to the operations tab, you can see the first stage is a full import. And what this means is we're talking to Active Directory via the management agent and importing into the Active Directory connector space within inside of MIM. And you can see that we have 224 adds. If I click that, you can see each of the objects. You can see the root of the domain, the OU structure, and all of the accounts. So once we have information inside the connector space, the next task is to synchronize that connector space with the metaverse, and that's the full sync. And you can see here that we actually have 211 what's called projections. And if we click this, you see we don't have the OU structure, we just have the root and then the user objects. But in fact, we also have less user objects. If we take a look at the filtered disconnectors, here are our disabled accounts. So conceptually, this is pretty important to understand. The connector space for each connected system, in this case Active Directory, contains a complete copy, if you will, of the source system. It's the metaverse that contains the consolidated identity information of all the connected systems, including all of the things like join rules, disconnectors, and so on. So that's why we need to do kind of two processes. We're then going to do basically exactly the same for the SharePoint management agent, a full import. And of course the profile store is empty at present, so there aren't any objects to import, and then we synchronize that with the connector space. Now if we scroll down a little bit, you can see here the outbound synchronization based on the configuration that's deployed by the toolkit already knows that the next stage is going to export some attributes to SharePoint, and we can actually click these and see that we now have a list of users based on the SharePoint identifier, which is a legacy NetBIOS name, and you can see the old values obviously that didn't exist in SharePoint at present, and then the new values have been populated from the various attributes in Active Directory. So the toolkit is kind of waiting for user input at the moment because I use the verbose flag here. It's basically telling me it's going to add 210 objects into SharePoint, so I'm going to say go ahead and do that. And what's going to happen now is it's going to run the export run profile for the SharePoint management agent. Now this guy's the slowest player on the park, as it were. This guy is the one that's really actually doing work against that import-export web service. Remember, that's a legacy ASMX web service, and just generally is slow to work with. So we've got a quite a big pause here whilst it appears as if not a lot is happening, and we just basically have to wait until it kicks in. And here we go. You can see that we've got 210 adds, and this is the data. Now interestingly, we also have some updates, and if we look at these are updates to existing profiles. Now this is to deal with the reference data, the manager attribute. If we're adding a profile for my account into SharePoint and that profile is called Spence, we can't add the manager to my profile to be Gabriel until the Gabriel profile exists. So the first stage is to create all of the profiles, and then we go back and touch up the reference data, and you can see it down here. The add included an empty manager field because this data didn't exist at that point. There wasn't a profile for the other user, and then we update it. And then what happens is we do what's called a delta import and a delta sync. Once we've written changes to a connected system, we also then need to import changes back and synchronize again to make sure that the state within the meta directory is consistent with the system that we've just exported to. It's the concept of confirming receipts. And you can see that we have connectors without flow updates, and it's the 210 accounts. So in theory, at this point, we've basically implemented the core functionality of the toolkit, and we should see over in SharePoint that information. So fingers crossed, we'll come back over to SharePoint 2016, refresh the UPA, and you can see now we have 211 objects. If we come in here and do a quick search for one of the users, open up Hazel's profile here, and you can see some of the information has been populated. So we have the name, the work telephone number, the title, but you'll notice that the manager here isn't showing up, and neither is the profile photo. So I'm just going to refresh this screen. See, still no manager. So once we do an initial full sync, there is a timer job that runs that will finalize the reference data, whether it be the manager attribute, or indeed it also takes care of some reference data with respect to other lookup objects and audiences. So instead of waiting for that for the purposes of the demonstration, I'm going to go ahead and kick off that timer job manually. And because we've only got a very small amount of data here, it's quite quick. And the name of the timer job is a really memorable and easy to say quickly one called External Identity Manager Membership and Relationships job. And you need to take a deep breath after you're saying that. Once we've run that, if we refresh this screen, we can now see that the manager data has been updated. Now the profile pictures is a different story. This actually isn't any different with MIM, with the exception of that user policy that we had to create. If we take a look at the My Site Host site collection here, you can see that we've got a user photos folder, and then within that user photos folder, it library, that's a library, it creates a folder called profile pictures. So photos, pictures, profile, user, don't ask, don't tell. But we'll go in there and you can see that we have one image for each user, although some of them are actually copies, just because of my sample data is a bit hit and miss. You can see they're named with a GUID and then underscore and then an identifier. So in this example, this one on screen, is the identifier for the user is 10. That GUID is the same for all of these profiles. This is 100, 101, 102, and so on. That GUID is the GUID of the UPA, or indeed the subscription if you were in a multi-tenant environment. So these pictures is the 128 pixel square JPEG, this exact same binary data that was in AD. That's no good to us in SharePoint. It doesn't use these files, so we need to run another task to convert these images into the appropriate format. So again, that's a PowerShell task where we basically run update SP profile photo store using the My Site host. So I'm going to run that, and it does take a little while to run. Whilst we're waiting on that, I'll point out the importance of making sure that you run this commandlet on a machine that's hosting the user profile service instance. If you run it on a machine that doesn't host it, for example distributed cache or search, the commandlet will complete with no error, but it won't do anything. And you can't trap a non-existent exception, so you just need to make sure that this is scheduled to run on the machine or a machine that's running the user profile service instance. So if we come back over here and refresh, we can see some change in the behavior. It's still going. If I refresh here, it's still going. It's 451. We're looking for about 620 odd. So you can see the count is increasing each time I hit refresh as it goes through. And basically what it's doing is for each image it's creating 3 different thumbnails and then deleting the source thumbnail. So it's nearly there. Nothing more exciting than sitting here waiting for it to catch up. Almost there, a couple more to do, and there we are, it's finished. So if we refresh this screen, you can now see that each user has 3 images, a large thumbnail, medium thumbnail and small, and the one with the GUID has been deleted. So again, if we come back to the profile for Hazel, we refresh the screen, you can see it's using, I believe that's the small thumbnail there in this screen. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do for this demonstration is initiate a search crawl. Not something that we're going to sit and watch, of course, because that will take quite a while. But it will help speed up a later demo. So whilst this is running, I'm going to go and get a coffee and pause the video, and then we'll come back and we'll start off with the second part of the demonstration. So here's a recap of what we've seen in the first demonstration. We basically configured some prerequisites on SharePoint in order to start working with Identity Manager. We took care of the External Identity Manager option, the NetBIOS domain names. We made sure or verified that we had replicating directory changes for the AD management agent account. We made the SharePoint management agent a farm administrator, and we also added it to a new custom permission policy and user policy on the My Site host web application. Then we used the MIM toolkit to import the basic starter configuration. We added the user account control property and a filter on that to prevent disabled accounts coming across. We looked at fixing the password on the AD management agent. Then we ran a full synchronization, and we dealt with the manager reference data and the AD thumbnail photo on the SharePoint side following synchronization. So that's our current state. The next stage is to extend the system so that we also now can import or synchronize the data from the line of business system, which is hosted on SQL Server. We're also going to want to export that to SharePoint as well, and we can also take a look at some of the other considerations regarding synchronization operations, but also the importance of planning and having a worksheet before we get started so that it's easier to deal with errors and mistakes. There's a lot of pointing and clicking and pecking around within the user interface here, and the inevitable end result of that is that there will be mistakes. So you can see our full crawl is completed. Just going to validate that this is actually working by searching for a user. You can see that's actually picking up Hazel, but if we use one of our custom or properties, which is actually a school in the database, obviously that hasn't been configured yet. Okay, so we'll also take a look at the term store here, and if we expand out the people, you can see we have a couple of additional term sets here, employee status and employee type, which I've already created ahead of time, and we're going to make use of those a little bit later. The other ones, department, job title and location, of course, are the defaults when we configure the basic file. Okay, so the first stage is we had some attributes in that SQL Server database, and we want to bring them into SharePoint. So the first thing we need to do is obviously create some properties for them to go into. So I'm going to come into the UPA here and choose Manage User Properties, and we're going to go ahead and create some new properties. So this is the same old thing that we've all been doing since time immemorial. I'm just going to call this Employee ID. I'm going to pop in the display name there, and the employee ID, I want this to be a integer, so I'm going to select the type there, and I'm also just going to change up the policy settings so that everyone can view it and that we show it in the various screens. Now in the real world you want to be quite careful about planning out these policy display and privacy settings so that you're making sure that PII is managed correctly. But for the purposes of the demonstration, I'm just going to show them all basically. And of course, again, in the real world you would probably script the creation of these things rather than pecking through this interface. But again, for the purposes of demonstration, it's better to use the UI. So this one, employee type, is going to be a string, but I want to configure this up to that term set that we saw just a few moments ago. So I'm going to configure this to use the employee type. I'll also change the privacy and display settings, and then we've got one more to do, and this one is employee status. Oops. And do the same thing for this guy. It's going to be a string, a taxonomic property, and again the privacy and display. All good. Now we don't need to do anything with the school because SharePoint itself already has a schools property, so we can just leverage that a little later on. So that's all we need to do on the SharePoint side for the time being. We're going to switch over to the Identity Manager server and back into the Sync Service Manager. Now we've configured these properties in SharePoint, but for some of them it's quite an important design decision where we choose to store them within the metaverse. I go over to the Metaverse Designer and again select that person object. I'm going to come down to the bottom here where we see a list of attributes. I'm just going to hit the E on my keyboard and it jumps, and you can see that we have employee ID, employee status and employee type. So we have a choice here. We can either choose to use these default attributes that exist in the metaverse or create our own. Now in this particular case, if you remember, when I created the employee ID, I created that as an integer, and so Mim will actually stop us using this attribute. I would need to delete it and create a new one. I can't change a data type. And so you need to be cautious in that respect. In most cases you want to stay away from the defaults. They're defaults for a reason, to support some of the other management agents and sample configurations and so forth. But this screen also shows us the import flow. Gives you an indication of are there any management agents currently using this. You can see the first name is being used by the AD one, so if we did make any changes to that, we could have a knock-on impact on that configuration. So generally speaking, the best practice is to kind of stay away from changing the out-of-the-box ones. So therefore what I'm going to do is I'm going to double click the person object type, and I'm going to create some new attributes in the metaverse for my custom configuration. I'm going to name them with the prefix SPS. Now that's not necessarily a recommendation. I'm doing that to make the demo a bit easier for myself mostly. I'm going to choose number, which in MIM terminology will support an integer or a long, etc. So that one's okay. We'll do another one for SPS employee type, and this one is a string. A new one for SPS, oops, get that right, dash employee status, and then the last one is school, SPS school. That's also a string, but it's important that we make sure that we check multi-valued here, because that's going to contain more than one value. And once we've done that, we can see the new ones displayed here. We click OK, this refreshes, and now we have the additional attributes available to us in the metaverse. But once we've done that, we can now go ahead and configure another management agent, which is going to be responsible for bringing in the information from the SQL Server table into the SQL Server connector space. So I right click in the management agent screen and I'll choose create. You can see this drop down we saw a little bit earlier, but these are all the management agents that ship with Microsoft Identity Manager plus the SharePoint one that we install separately. So we can speak to quite a lot of systems here, and we have some general purpose ones for dealing with what we refer to as sneakernet synchronization, text files, XML and so on. And then the extensible connectivity 2.0 in particular provide us with the capability to build our own custom management agents using the .NET framework, and that's actually exactly what the SharePoint Profile Store one is. It's also worth pointing out that you can get third-party management agents for pretty much every system that's out there, and they come either from the vendor of that system or by a third party such as Oxford Computer Group. So generally speaking, you can find the management agent you're looking for without having to resort to custom development. So of course I'm going to pick SQL Server here, and I'm going to give it a name. I'm not going to call it SQL MA, I'm going to call it something sensible this time, and we'll use Fabricam HR. and I click next. Now it's asking me for the connection information. So, where is my SQL Server instance? This is actually the alias that I'm using. Then it's going to ask me for the database itself, which is Fabricam HR. Then it's asking me for the table. So in our case, if you remember, the table was called employee data. Then we can enter in the multi-value table, so we can combine the import of single value data with multi-value by entering in the name here, and this time it was a view, so we'll put in there view employee school. And then of course finally the connection information. So I've already ahead of time created an account in AD called SQL MA, and I've provided that account with permissions on the database. Oops. So assuming I enter in the credentials correctly, it goes and speaks to the database and retrieves the schema from the table, the first table that we entered. And you can see what it does here. It recognizes the schema and therefore the column types, and it makes its sort of best attempt at mapping the database types with the type inside of MIM. So you can see GUID goes to a string, long int goes to a number, the rest are strings. And this usually is pretty decent, but we can edit this and make some changes if we wish to. But it is important that you figure out the type mappings ahead of time if you're doing anything a bit more complicated. Now what is really important is the anchor. The anchor is the most fundamental aspect of Identity Manager Sync. It's how the subsystems keep track of objects and determine whether the objects need to be updated, deleted, etc. So it's important to use an immutable value for an anchor, and in this case it's correctly seen that the ID column is a GUID and is a primary key in the database, and therefore it's automatically selected. It's made a good educated guess here about what we want to use as the anchor. But let's say, for example, we chose to use the email address as the anchor. That's a very bad idea because the email address can quite often change. People get married, they might change their name. Indeed, in some situations, mergers, acquisitions, the email address of every user in an organization changes. Therefore, what happens when an anchor changes is the original object is deleted and a new one is created. Now in this example with a couple of hundred users, that's no big deal really. It's not going to take very long to filter out to all the connected systems. But if you consider a deployment with 150,000 objects distributed across the globe, you can see the carnage that might be caused by using the wrong anchor attribute. The next thing is multi-value. So this columns display up here basically just deals with the primary table that we're working with. So we're going to go ahead and click the multi-value button, and this refers back to that view I created. We need to specify the attribute name column, and that's why I called that column attribute name. It makes it very straightforward for me to remember what I'm doing here. Then I'm going to select the string attribute column, which is school. That's actually the data itself. There's 3 entries for each user in this example, and then I'm going to configure the attribute which I'm looking up from the attribute name table column. Sorry, this is how I'm doing the match. So I'm going to enter that in there as school and click OK. Again, these types have to match the types in the view itself. They're not exposed, but again, the importance of a planning spreadsheet. So I click OK and click Next. We're not concerned about a connection filter here with the SQL Server. We want to bring over all the objects, but we do need to deal with matching them to an existing object in the system. So at the moment, we've got AD import that brings in objects into the metaverse. So now the join and projection rules allow us to configure how we connect these objects together or where they need to be created. So in this case I'm going to choose a new join rule. I'm going to do it based on the email address because that's the one piece of information that exists both in Active Directory and in SQL Server. So I'm matching based on the employee email address in SQL Server, and the attribute in the metaverse is mail. And I'm going to choose to add the condition. It's going to give us a little warning regarding non-indexed values. Don't really care about that. And then I'm going to click OK. So that join rule determines how we match the accounts and join them together. I'm going to click next and it brings us back to our attribute flow screen. I'm going to make it a bit bigger again just so that you can see easier what's happening, and it's a little bit easier for me as well. So I'm going to map various columns from my database on the left hand side here with values in the metaverse. So department, I'm going to bring that across into the metaverse department, and that one is already sort of half mapped up because it's connected using the SharePoint management agent. Oh, sorry, the AD management agent and the SharePoint management agent. So I'll click New, and it adds it to the top here. Then I'm going to do employee ID, and I'm going to map that to the new attribute that I created a few moments ago, employee ID. I'm going to do the same for type. I'm going to do it for status. Now, why is status not employee status? Well, that again is a deliberate little thing in the demo because usually we don't have the luxury of being able to define the schema of the existing line of business system. So again, just to underline the importance of having a planning spreadsheet that defines all of this, because lots of little things like that can be a little bit confusing. And then our school is the last one. So school is our attribute in the connector space, and we're going to map that to the SPS school metaverse attribute. So that's our attribute flow for SQL Server. I can basically click next and finish. We don't care about the other options at this point. The other thing we need to do for this management agent is create some run profiles in order to be able to actually perform sync operations. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new profile here. I'm going to call it full sync. Then I'm going to choose full synchronization here. Note that you can specify, a batch threshold here and things like that. I'm just going to stick with all the defaults. Then I'm going to create one called full import. I choose full import. Next. And another thing that we can do here is combine sync runs together just to make it a little bit easier later on when we come to performing scheduled activity. So I'm going to do one here called full import and full sync, and select that option there, and there's my run profiles. Okay, so that's our SQL Server Management Agent taken care of, but now I also need to alter the SharePoint Management Agent attribute flow so that we're going to be exporting those additional attributes to SharePoint. So again, come to my attribute flow screen. I'm really disappointed that after all these years we still can't have a sort of maximize button for the screen or retain the state. So you can see the ones that are already configured by the toolkit, and note here department is going to SPS department and department is also going to department. So one is the regular old-fashioned SharePoint 2003 text one, and then the SPS department is the taxonomic property. Or it might be the other way around, but anyway, there's two there. So we don't need to do anything with that one, but we do need to deal with the employee ID and status and so on. So I'm going to select employee ID here, and the data source attribute was and you see here is the sorts of things that define why we need to get comfortable with working with the MIM tooling, but also our planning worksheet again. We're not seeing our new attributes. So I'm going to cancel out of here. The reason for this is whilst it's a state-based meta directory, it retains the state of the connected systems. We've made changes to SharePoint, but at present MIM isn't aware of those new attributes in the profile store. If I come back and bring this up and do select attributes, and we zoom in between D and F here, you see we don't have any properties that begin with an E. So we need to tell the management agent about the changes in the connected system. So I'm going to do that by right-clicking the MA and choosing Refresh Schema. It's going to warn me, are you really sure you want to do this? And then it's going to ask me for the password. Again, another reason why you don't want to use the farm account, because the MIM administrator needs to know it. And you can see it retrieves the schema changes from SharePoint, validates them, and then updates them on the MIM server. So now I can go ahead, select those new attributes: employee ID, employee status, employee type. I think I also need to select school, which existed before but wasn't selected. It's down here somewhere. Yep, there we go. There's SPS school. So select those attributes. Now I can go ahead and do my attribute flow. So it is now showing up here, employee ID, and we can do that, but this time it's a export. Okay, so that's important, and we can see, and it shows us up here once it's added. So I'm going to do the same for employee status and employee type, and then lastly is our SPS school. Oops, there we go. And so now we have the export attribute flow configured. I can go ahead and click OK. So that's the configuration complete. Let's now go ahead and perform some synchronization runs. So I'm going to, on the SQL management agent, I'm going to go ahead and run a full import. And you can see how quick this is. This management agent is using T-SQL, and it takes a few seconds basically to bring across 217 adds. So you can see it's adding all of these into the SQL Server connector space, or more accurately the Fabricam HR connector space. And you see the old value didn't exist, new value, all our different values from the table, and you can see our multi-value data for the school here. And you see this particular individual, Gerald, he's a pretty smart guy, right? A posh guy. Went to Arden, that's a posh school. Then he went to Oxford, and then he went to work for Microsoft. So clearly a brain box. So that information has been brought into the Fabricam HR connector space. The next task, of course, is to run a full synchronization, which will sync the connector space with the metaverse. And you can see that we've already had 72 joins. So it's using that join rule that we created to map, based on the email address, that it's going to join this information to an existing object in the metaverse. And once that's finished, we're all good. I'm just double checking. Here's our flow updates. Yeah, so we're all good. Now at this point we should also, strictly speaking, run a SharePoint full import and full sync. Now we haven't changed anything whilst the demo's been going on, but it could be the case that somebody's updated a attribute in SharePoint, or there's some change happened, and indeed you can see we've got some updates already showing up here, because it's recognized that the objects need to be updated with that new data, right? The department, the employee ID, and so on. and that's completed. We'll then do a full sync. And we really need to do, strictly speaking, we need to do full import and full sync at any point we make a schema or configuration change. There are situations, particularly in kind of development environments or test environments, where you don't need to really go to that degree. And of course, with a small amount of objects, it doesn't really matter. But just bear that in mind. Just like with the old SharePoint approaches with user profile sync, if you added a property mapping, a full sync was required. So once we've done a full sync, we come down here and we see our export attribute flow again, just as we saw when we were initially starting. You can see the profile value in SharePoint is currently empty for department, employee ID, employee status, and so on, and there's our new value. So when we perform the export, these are the values that will be updated. So the next step again, of course, is to do a synchronization, or sorry, an export on the SharePoint MA to write those changes back to SharePoint. And again, this is the one that, you know, has the has kind of the sluggishness, but you can again see the updates coming through as you would expect. Now once that's complete, we need to do our delta import and delta sync again. If you remember the concept of confirming receipts once we make a change, it's a bit like when you pay for your taxi. Obviously you want the receipt from the driver so that you can then prove that you actually did take that taxi ride. And you can see that it's actually making updates here to some of the values in the objects. So this actually ensures, assuming okay, it's completed with warnings, that's okay, we'll come back to those in a second. That's intentional. I'm just going to do the delta sync, and this basically ensures that the state remains consistent across all of the connected systems, the connector space and the metaverse. Now these warnings, I've pre-canned the demo so that actually I'm quite surprised that only one warning here is. It usually is two, but I have two accounts that have got something slightly amiss with them, and that's very common. You know, if you imagine an Active Directory with 75,000 users, the chances are there's going to be some dodgy accounts in there, and this is really just to show you, how you can diagnose and troubleshoot problems. It's all available in here, and you can actually go through the lineage and look at all the different objects and so on. It's pretty powerful, and indeed if we didn't have replicating directory changes, it would say right here it does not have the appropriate permissions. So that's our scenario complete for the most part. A couple of other things to point out. We can search the connector space as we go through, so you can look in here, and these are all the objects in the SharePoint connector space. You can double click it to view all of the properties. It's actually quite useful for viewing user profile properties in a much more scalable UI than the SharePoint one, as a slight aside. And we can also do the same for the metaverse. So you can compare and contrast, the objects in the connected systems with the objects in the metaverse. You can also view the different connectors. So for this particular metaverse object, we're projecting from AD, we're provisioning to SharePoint, and we're joining from the SQL Server. And the more complex it gets, of course, the more useful these views are for troubleshooting and so on. Okay, so let's flip back to SharePoint, and hopefully we'll see the end result of all that work. So if we use our wonderful breadcrumb to go back over here, and we look in here and do a search, we'll bring up Hazel again, edit the profile for Hazel, and you can see we've got much more information now populated. The department's coming across both to the text field and to the taxonomic property. If we scroll down a little bit, we can see the schools, and you can see that that's a taxonomic property as well, so the multi-value data has worked correctly. And then if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, we'll see our custom properties. Aha, there's a problem here. So the employee ID and employee type has worked, but the employee status has failed. So what's going on there? Let's take a look at the term store and see if that gives us any kind of pointer. So yeah, we can see that the employee type has come across. The job titles, they were working before, our department's now working, and that's coming from the SQL Server, remember, as well as the employee type. But our employee status is empty. So it's not that it hasn't worked for Hazel, it's that it's not worked for anybody. So if we click this, I've pre-canned this deliberately on purpose to be broken. You can see here the submission policy is closed, and the only person who can create terms in a term set that has a closed submission policy is a metadata manager. In other words, somebody that's basically in this has permissions within this tool, and of course our management agent account SPMA isn't in here. So theoretically, you know, we could add that user in here, or we could just make the policy open, which is what I'm going to do here, and click save. But this isn't going to help us, and I've deliberately chosen this because it's a good example which demonstrates the mechanism by which the SharePoint management agent works and why we need to be careful with it. Because the problem is, if we come over to MIM and we take a look at the operations again, and we go into the export phase and bring up these updates, bring up one of the users, this is Donald Hubbard, okay, and you can see here his employee status is active. If we come over to the management agent and we search the connector space for SharePoint, his name was, oh, we can't do it like that, we have to pick a different user. Let's stick here with a different Donald. You can see his employee status is active, but we know that that's not in SharePoint. So the connector space, even though we did the confirming import, as far as MIM is concerned, everything worked. There is no work to do. So the employee status exists in the connector space, and if we come over here and search the metaverse, you can see that it exists in the metaverse as well. Now the reason for this is because we've used the SharePoint connector uses that web service, and then that web service writes to the user profile which attempts to create the taxonomic an entry in the term set if it's not there already. And the problem is that exception is not caught or bubbled back by the web service. So as far as the management agent is concerned inside of MIM, everything worked correctly. If I go ahead and run right now a full import and a full sync, it will not update that information in SharePoint, even though I've corrected the configuration in the term store. So we need to be aware of that. There's nothing we can do here to deal with this issue other than for Microsoft SharePoint to fix the user profile import export web service. That's the only resolution to this. So we need to bear that in mind for the more sort of advanced properties, in other words the term store backed properties. We might hit issues such as this. We might hit it with other profile properties as well, like a type mismatch or similar. So in order to get around this, once we've made the correction on the SharePoint side, I'm basically going to go ahead and choose delete on the SharePoint management agent, but then I'm going to choose to delete the connector space only. I don't want to throw away all the hard work that the toolkit has done and then that I've added on top. It's just the information in the connector space that I want to delete. So go ahead and do that. It says, are you really sure? We'll click OK, and it's going to go ahead and clear out the connector space, effectively reset it for SharePoint. Then I'm going to go ahead and run a full import. And you can see it's adding the accounts again. We'll just wait for this to finish. It won't take too long. Famous last words. And then I'm going to do a full sync. Open up the same user, and you can see now we have an add for the employee status. So it's attempting again, but that because MIM didn't know there was a problem previously and thought everything was okay. This is the only way to kind of resolve that once we've made the change in SharePoint, is to basically do another set of runs here to update that information. Hopefully that's complete. Then of course we need to do another export run, which will implement this export attribute flow down here. And then again we'll do a delta import and delta sync once this one has completed. So again, I've picked this or done this deliberately to show you the importance of the small things. It's just one tiny little misconfiguration over in the term store. One setting which has a big knock-on effect, and then of course there's all the types of mistakes, typos and so on that you can make with inside Identity Manager itself, of course, that contribute to that. So again, the importance of planning things out, but also understanding the interaction of the subsystems so that if something does go wrong, you know how to deal with it. So I'm going to go ahead and run a delta import and a delta sync. And then once this is complete, we can have another look over in SharePoint and hopefully everything is good. Oops, wrong screen. Run delta sync. And you can see that there are very little work there. So we're good to go in theory. If we come back over onto SharePoint and we refresh this screen, we should now see the employee status has been populated there, the 3 different values. And again, if we come back to Hazel's profile here, you can see that the custom profile property has also been populated. So just a quick example of how a small error can knock us sideways, and then how we can deal with that. The very last thing, of course, is to do a incremental crawl, and we'll leave that running for a couple of minutes just to cover a few other things over on the MIM server. So these sync runs that we've been performing manually within this tool, and also the ones that were kicked off by this commandlet, is really the core thing that we need to design in from an operational perspective. We're going to want to be running, incremental sync once a day or something like that. And so we can use a similar approach that the toolkit uses to schedule or bundle up run profiles in order to then schedule them to run, at 1 AM without any operator intervention. So I'm just going to go ahead and open the PowerShell module that defines this start SharePoint sync commandlet. It's fairly simple stuff. We'll just make this a little bit easier to see. So there's our SharePoint start SharePoint sync. It's an advanced function. It has a parameter called delta, which basically is the incremental sync. And so if it's a incremental sync, you can see what it kicks off. It does a delta import and a delta sync for both AD and SharePoint. But note it doesn't do an export. Okay. And if we're doing a full sync, it does a full import, full sync, full import, full sync for both. So all we're doing is making use of this commandlet, start management agent, which is a standard way of working or automating run profiles with Identity Manager. And here you can see we have utilities to get the management agent, and so on and so forth. Here's the code that kicks off an MA run. Very simple stuff. So once we've got that, we'd use Windows Task Scheduler to, or an alternative scheduling tool, maybe something from the likes of Syskit, to provide us with our execution engine for those operations. We of course have the history in here that we can use to debug problems that, the next morning and so on. And don't forget the ability to search the connector spaces as you go through your initial exploration of the system and how it works. It's very powerful despite the kind of old-fashioned user interface. The other thing to point out is the provisioning rules extension, the Metaverse rules extension. That is compiled and deployed by the toolkit. If you do want to make changes to the way that works, that is possible. And indeed, this is the only part of the toolkit that's required. So we need to use a rules extension in order to project objects into the profile store. That's just down to the nature of the way the user profile store identifies profiles. And it also means we must use classic provisioning. In other words, all of the things that I've shown you in the service manager here. But that's the only part of the toolkit that's a requirement, and we could customize it if we saw fit. So you don't need to use the toolkit. Everything that I've done could be done manually. And really the idea is that once we have the configuration in a test environment as we want it, we go ahead and export the management agents to flat files. These are to XML files. So this is the ADMA. And then we could import that configuration into production and change the connection string information for each one. And that's basically what the toolkit does when it's importing that initial configuration. It's just doing it based on a kind of copy of what SharePoint 2013 used to do. So if we come back over to SharePoint just very briefly to finish off, we're almost on the time limit of 90 minutes. You can see our crawler's finished. If we come back over here and do a search, this is always going to be slow, unfortunately, to kind of reload this page. Now if we do a search for MCA, you can see that our term has been picked up. I've made a mess of the display template here in the demo, but you can see it's picking up and basically giving us the same functionality that we had over in SharePoint 2013 with the same properties, the org chart, the image, and so on. And so that's it in a nutshell for the identity synchronization or profile synchronization with Identity Manager. Just again a quick recap here in terms of the second demo. We created some user profile properties in SharePoint. We used the SQL management agent We created some additional metaverse attributes, we configured the flow between them, we dealt with multi-value data, we then wrote them back to SharePoint. We spoke a little bit about how we deal with scheduling tasks for operational purposes and how to deal with errors and mistakes. So hopefully it's all been useful. The code is all available, or rather it's kind of stupid to call it code. The scripts are all available on GitHub. The link is in the on the blog page that hopefully you're viewing the video from. And if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. So hopefully it's been useful. Thanks very much for sticking with it all the way through, and I'll see you on the next video. Take care.